Hi there. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Jerry Schmidt, broker and principal at Pacifica Commercial Realty, and Karen O'Neill, principal at Kirk and Simas, overseeing employment and landlord issues. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So today we'd like to just talk a little bit about landlord and tenant issues and kind of help out our community. Just understand what may be taking place, how to prevent issues, and how to maybe work on solutions if they are finding themselves in problems. So what I'd like to do is just ask you a few questions. First one, just kind of finding out what you're seeing from the business environment in the area of the landlord and tenant issues and possibilities of unpaid rent that may be resulting in evictions. Can you answer anything about that?
Yeah, I'll actually take that one. So in the beginning of March, we started seeing some of the communications coming from not only tenants, but landlords regarding COVID-19. We represent about 1 million square feet of commercial properties that we manage in Santa Maria on the Central Coast. We've been representing the brokerage community, doing commercial real estate transactions, sales and leases for the last 30 years. So we're kind of in the trenches a little bit when it comes to decision making, when it comes to trying to reconcile issues. It seems that we have a tendency we find out a little bit more on the leading edge. And this case was kind of interesting because in the beginning of March, it just seemed like there was so much uncertainty. There were a lot of what ifs. We received quite a few phone calls from landlords, tenants, businesses, asking us to look into the crystal ball and see what we thought. And at the time, there really wasn't any objective information that we could share other than what you would see in the news. And it was a little bit surreal as it was getting closer and closer to home. Once the stay-at-home, the social distancing, the shelter-in-place thing became a reality, then we took, it's not as though we weren't serious, but we started realizing we had to have some very clear answers for people at a time when there really weren't clear answers. So it's been a little bit challenging, but we've done the best we can to respond, and it seems like there's more and more objective information out there for us to work from.
And I would agree with everything that Jerry said. I mean, for a good 3-4 week period, life was changing every day, and the interpretation was changing every day, and really our clients just needed to know, what do we recommend that they do, and I appreciate that Jerry and his organization was really ahead of the curve and really looking at that and counseling his clients accordingly.
Great. So do you think there's any evictions taking place right now or happening during the COVID-19 or trying to? I mean, talk to us about what can and can't be done and what is being done.
So first I want to explain how we got here. So first there was the governor's order on March 4th, which declared a state of emergency. And what's important to take into account is once there's a declaration of emergency, that then triggers anti-profiteering statutes. And so those statutes prevent merchants from selling items for much more than their value. It prevents hotels from charging a lot more for those rooms. The idea is to prevent price gouging. The idea is to prevent charging $68 for some hand sanitizer. So that was triggered. And part of that anti-profiteering statute is also a hold or a moratorium on evictions for 30 days as it relates to residential tenants. And then the governor came out with another order just a little bit later that extended that anti-profiteering statute through May 31st. And then there was another order that came out that because there was concern about residential tenants and commercial tenants during this crisis, they wanted to give some protections to them. And so the governor empowered local agencies, local municipalities, to enact some temporary statutes to protect both the commercial tenants and the residential tenants. And what's important is at this point now we are talking commercial as well as residential. And so once that happened, then you saw the counties and the cities start to enact ordinances. And then the governor came out with yet another order, which is more specific to unlawful detainers. In response to that, the city of Santa Maria enacted its own ordinance, which was a moratorium on evictions, which was following the governor's order. So at this point in time, and life changes every day in the COVID crisis. So I would say that I'm not sure when someone may watch this video, but check the city website, check the state website, see if there have been any changes. But as of right now, there are really not any evictions going on. There are some exceptions, but there really aren't. The city ordinance limits evictions in a few different ways. So first, there's the residential evictions. We want to make sure that people are protected in their homes. So a landlord cannot evict a residential tenant if it's for a lack of payment of rent, and if that lack of payment of rent relates to COVID-19. Also, if the landlord had given, maybe 6 months notice 6 months ago that they were going to take back the property and sell it, even those evictions are on hold. Now, the commercial tenants, again, if they have not paid rent and if they've given notice to the landlord that the failure to pay rent is related to COVID-19, then those evictions are stayed as well. Also, from just a practical standpoint, the courts are closed. The courts are really only open for emergency purposes right now. And it's considered a court holiday, so we can't really file anything until May 26th. And then there's a court order, and they're not going to issue summonses so that you can have an unlawful detainer or an eviction action unless it relates to the prevention of some kind of health and safety issue. So those are the orders that are in place right now.
It was my understanding, and Karen, I would appreciate some enlightenment on this. I'm familiar of one situation where there's a residential landlord who has a larger property with multiple tenants staying in different residences, all on the same parcel. And this is more of a rural type arrangement. And the owner of the property lives in the front house. One of the tenants has been continually hosting parties and events, unprotected, just not recognizing the social distancing or the stay at home. And that landlord posted a sign up at the front gate, notifying all the tenants that the only people onto the property allowed on the property were the tenants, and then people observing socially distanced and masks and gloves. And it's my understanding this tenant just blatantly violated and continued to is violating that I guess what would you call a stipulation. And in that case, in speaking with that landlord, she feels comfortable that she's going to be able to go forward with evicting this person because it's strictly related to COVID and it's related to health and safety of others. Can you kind of maybe touch base on that a little? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, because you raise a good point. The reason why these orders are in place is to protect people because of the financial component of what's happened with COVID-19, whether it's commercial or residential. But there are other reasons why people may need to be removed from the property. And the court order specifically says that they will move forward with evictions relating to public safety issues. Now, having said that, that landlord likely has a right or an ability to move forward with an eviction because of the public health and safety issue. That said, the courts are in essence closed through May 26th. Mm-hmm. So there would still be a practical delay to taking any kind of action.
Makes sense.
So if a business is unable to pay their rent due to the financial hardships that are taking place right now because of COVID-19, what should they do?
Susan, we've actually had quite a bit of experience here lately with that. And even from the beginning, our response has really been the same. We live in a society to where we're online all the time. We're on the phone. We see people. We're constantly in touch with each other. Well, this COVID-19 in the pandemic has implemented measures that none of us have ever seen in our lives. We've got, stay at home, shelter at home, social distancing, business closed, just a lot of stuff going on that's, striking a lot of fear in people. And effectively what that's doing is taking human beings that are social animals and forcing them to stay apart. So the first thing I tell tenants and landlords is reach out to your tenant, reach out to your landlord, call them on the phone, reach out to them personally. This is just kind of we require personal contact, and right now everybody is so isolated. I think the best thing people can do, and I recommend, is call people. Take away the fear, the concern, the question, call them. And what I have done with several people is just, I told them, don't underestimate. I mean, if you're just having a conversation with your landlord and you think you're going to make it, and you think there's a period of time and you're pretty comfortable if it's March, April, May, just tell them March, April, May. Don't say, well, I'm going to hold off on April and we'll see what happens in May. Just be realistic. And you're better off to tell your landlord up front a very realistic expectation and try to work your way through it. The landlord in return, I'm sure, will be happy to tell you what kind of his expectations are. I think people will be pleasantly surprised if they take the initiative and they call either their tenants or their landlord. I think they'll be pleasantly surprised at the response. I do know that another thing I've just told people, I mean, I want to be careful what I say. I've also told people, be realistic with yourself, with the small businesses. Look, if I tell them, if you were having a tough time making ends meet before this thing, there's a really good chance that you're not going to pull out of this. And so you're a lot better off to tell a landlord that. And the landlord, most of them realize if they've been getting irregular or, late payments on rent or whatever the case is, you're a lot better off to hit them square in the face with that and let them know, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it, and start a workout sooner rather than later, rather than having to, immediately go into the legal process. Because, as long as landlord and tenant agree we're going to terminate a lease and they do it, with mutual agreement, there's no point in having to go through 3-day notice, unlawful detainers, and all that other stuff. And so that's why I try to get people to be realistic with each other. I think it's so important, and reach out to people.
Do you see that is that kind of what you're feeling? Is there are quite a few businesses that may not be able to make it through this? I mean, the rent, that's a big amount of a payment for a lot of people. And I just think that, going forward, if they're being realistic, then they're probably being a little bit realistic, realizing that they may not be able to get caught up.
Yeah, sure. We haven't seen much of that yet.
Good.
And I'm very thankful to say that, representing the 40 or 50 property owners that we represent and the 300 or 400 tenants that we manage, we've had such a small percentage of people that have, number one, come back and ask for deferred rent or waived rent or announced problem. And I say, it's less than 20%, which is a relatively small number when you look at the larger component of it. And those aren't all, end of the world stories. I mean, these are people just saying, look, we're going to be offset on our receivables for a while, so we need to defer rent. We'll make it up. And by the way, most of the people that we've talked to so far are not looking to have rent waived, permanently waived or permanently deferred. Most of them are looking for a reduction in rent for the time being while we go through this pandemic. And then either whether it's a waiver or deferment of rent would be either made up on the end of the lease or amortized over a period of time or spread out of the remaining balance. But that's the type of stuff that happens when people are actually communicating back and forth. And I haven't had any circumstances yet that we've been involved with where there's been a hostile party either way. I mean, I've talked to a couple of landlords that, realistically, I think they talk a big game, but at the end of the day, they also, exactly what you said earlier, they've got tenants. They want to keep tenants. Why go out and try to find new ones after you've gone through some legal process? Just try to work it out, folks.
Right.
And I would agree with that. I would agree with 100% with what Jerry said. So it's important to remember that even though there's a moratorium on evictions, there's still an obligation to pay rent. Mm-hmm. And I absolutely agree with Jerry that it makes more sense to have communication, because an eviction process is not a positive experience for the landlord or the tenant. And if the tenant isn't communicating with the landlord, then that tenant may end up with a judgment. And if there's a financial judgment and there's an eviction on their record, it's going to be more difficult for that tenant, whether it's residential or commercial, for another landlord to rent to them. So there are long-term consequences that can be resolved by just communicating and being reasonable with one another. We're all in this together. We can get through this together, but it takes communication.
I like that. I agree. I think that that's key in anything in life. So if a business does receive a letter or a notice of eviction, what would that look like? I mean, it can't just be a letter. It's probably an official court document, but I don't know. I'm asking you. And then if they do receive something like that, what steps should they be taking to remedy that situation if it's gone that far?
So I think there are a couple of things that a tenant may receive. One might be just a letter, because there is a misunderstanding, a misnomer out there that tenants don't have to pay rent. And the moratorium is not on, the obligation doesn't go away. So a letter reminding the tenant of that obligation, I think, is perfectly permissible. As long as the tone is civil, and as Jerry points out, as long as it encourages communication. A 3-day notice to pay rent or quit right now would be problematic under most circumstances. And so if you receive something like that, you should contact your broker, your attorney, your landlords, talk to them about it. But there's probably an issue with that 3-day notice if it's based on the failure to pay rent, and if your inability to pay it was based on COVID.
And I think Karen's point is spot on. It's the uncertainty and not knowing and people anticipating, well then maybe my rent's going to be free for the next couple of months, and that's just not the case.
Right.
And there's been some landlords that we've talked to who've shown a willingness to waive rent for some period of time, but the majority of the landlords we're working with, and even the tenants from that perspective, understand that they are deferring either all or a portion of the rent until a better day, until the sun is shining again and everybody's out doing business. And in that case, they're either working out, full or stepped up payments or whatever the case is. But for the most part, people are looking for, someone to help them get through this process. But I think it's really critical that tenants realize that, the COVID pandemic is not an excuse to not pay rent. And it can be, there was one tenant that I was involved with personally that made a phone call to us and just said, "Hey, I'm just calling to let you know I'm not paying my rent in March or April." And that was a little bit shocking. We acknowledged that they have protections from the government, and there wouldn't be much we as landlords could do until we had better direction or were remedied. But I also was clear to tell the tenant that as soon as we're out of this situation, they were not going to find a friendly relationship with the landlord that they so abruptly, directed on what they were going to do. And it was interesting because their response was that a day or two later, they deposited part of the rent and basically said that it was never in their intent to not pay rent. They just need some of it deferred, and then they'll make it up in the long run. So, I think it's important for people to realize rent is due. Unless there's a different agreement, unless there's an agreement between landlord and tenant, rent is due, and it will have to be made up at some point in time, generally in the future. That's my understanding.
And it's interesting to me because some of the people that I have spoke to think that, landlords can cover it. And I don't think that they realize sometimes that the landlords are paying a bill to the bank. And so then the banks, it's a trickle up effect. Everybody's being affected by this. So yeah. I think that there's got to be workable solutions. So hearing that, some of them can get their rent deferred down the road, it's helpful. And I would hope that most landlords and tenants are able to work out those situations where that's happening. I'm just wondering if it is happening for everybody, for most people. Karen, are you hearing that you're having issues with some of the landlord people that you're representing? Are there issues where tenants aren't communicating?
Some tenants are reaching out, and those are the ones that we can work the most effectively with. And other tenants are not. And that's the problem, is when the communication breaks down, it makes it difficult to forge a solution together. Some are working with the landlords and some are not, and that's going to be problematic, the ones that aren't.
And I think my advice, the last thing a tenant would want to do is avoid contacting his landlord or avoid responding to the landlord or the property manager when they're reaching out trying to figure out, hey, how can we work our way through this? I think it's a strong advice. Take the call, or even more so, be proactive and call them. I think you'll find a much friendlier audience and a much more workable solution rather than trying to, bury your head in the sand.
What kind of workable solutions are there?
Well, deferred rent, waiving rent, quite a few things. So that's kind of gets back to my point. Be realistic when you sit down and try to figure out, if you're a tenant, what it is you need. I mean, if you truly can't pay March and you think you can pay half of, April, or excuse me, you didn't pay March, you think you can pay, make up or pay half of April, and you might even make or miss June's payment, just be realistic and give all that information to the landlord up front. That way you're not working out what is hopefully a remediation on this thing. And then we get to June 1 and you still need help and you have to go back for another bite of the apple. I think landlords are most workable when they get all the variables kind of known up front and they can work their way through it. That's my opinion.
And I think Jerry touched on this, that even if you can't pay all of the rent, it certainly is a demonstration of good faith that we're working together on a solution when a tenant is willing to pay part of the rent. And also, if we're looking at deferring that rent over the next 6 months or term of the lease, if you're making some part of that payment, it's going to be easier. So I recommend that if there's some part of the rent that can be paid, that be worked into this resolution, because that really helps both parties.
Any other advice? I mean, what I'm hearing from you is communicate, kind of know what you're able to do and when you're able to do it and how much, right? I mean, even if they came to you and said, I can't pay on the 1st, but I can pay on the 20th, but I can only pay a half of my rent, and then next month I'll try to pay. I mean, that's what you're looking for. You're working for those workable solutions where a tenant knows what they're able to do or is trying to forecast, and then they're trying to do something, correct?
Yes,
So
that's
correct. If you've got a tenant that's trying to do something, trying to make an effort, trying to work with you, then landlords are more willing to work out a solution. They feel like there's open communication.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's correct.
So let me ask you one thing. What if they think they're going to be able to do all these things and they're not able to? Then how are landlords in that situation?
My first response is to keep the lines of communication open. I think a tenant should respond sooner rather than later. If a landlord is expecting something on the 1st and a tenant doesn't call them to the 5th and say, hey, I know what we agreed to a couple weeks ago or a month ago, but I'm still not there yet. That's difficult because the landlord on the 1st was thinking, okay, we've got a deal and we're going to work this out, and nothing. After 4 or 5 days, a landlord can start getting a little bit edgy. And so I think if you come to the point to where you still need some help and you're still not quite there yet, I think you're far better off to call the landlord in advance and say, look, we're working hard, we're getting close, I'm doing all I can, but I wanted to let you know I'm not going to make it by the 1st. I can make it by the by the 10th or whatever the case is. Just open, constant communication until this is all behind us and everybody is we've returned to some sense of normalcy. That's my opinion.
And I would echo that the landlord also has obligations that the landlord needs to meet. And it's more important to the landlord to have that open communication. And let's say on the 1st, you said you were going to pay 100% of the rent, but on the 1st, you call that landlord and say, I only have 75% of the rent. If you pay that 75% and you've made that call, that's going to go a lot farther than not making the call and not making any payment. Because again, the landlord has obligations, and the landlord wants to know and needs to know that this is a two-way street. Mm-hmm. As much as the landlord is making compromises, that you're in this together and you're both acting in good faith.
Can I ask you one more question? So I've had several phone calls regarding landlord and tenant issues, and one came up the other day where their landlord was actually wanting them to sign a document readjusting their rent payments, and it was set up the way that the landlord thought it should be, and the tenant was calling me saying, but if I sign this, I know I can't do this. I just don't think I'll be able to. I would be able to do half of what they were wanting. My advice to them was to go back and try to renegotiate that with them and be honest with them and say, you're asking me to sign something that I can't in good conscience sign because I know I can't fulfill that. but I'm finding that there are some landlords that are pushing some of these tenants, or maybe it's the tenant just doesn't want to give up that much cash. I don't know, but I think that do you ever see landlords expecting more than a tenant is maybe potentially able to do? In my mind, I'm thinking the landlord probably knows financially how the tenant is doing to be able to adjust that or not. I mean, how does that work? How do you come to what you would accept as a landlord from a tenant in a situation?
We've had a couple situations where landlords have been proactive and looking at their rents across the board have in terms of who the I don't want to say marginal, but who the tenants that had issues in the past or were kind of on the edge, or the smaller operators. Some of the landlords have been proactive and sent letters out in advance to the tenants and said, look, we know it's tough, so what we're going to do is we're going to discount your rent by $500 a month to kind of make it easier. Well, we were contacted by tenants, said the same thing. Gosh, 500, that's not enough. I don't know if I'm going to make rent this month. What do I do? And and it wasn't a property we were involved in. It's just another case. I just said, then contact the landlord and say, we're so grateful that you're going to be willing to work with us. We $500 is generous, but we're going to need rent, waived or deferred or more or whatever the case is. And again, it just gets back to communicating. And with respect to, if you've agreed to something with a landlord and you've been presented a written document and you look at the document and you have any question or concern, by all means, get someone to review it. That's what Kirk and Simas does. I can't tell you how many times I've sent documents over to Kirk and Simas and just said, hey, can you guys get eyes on this? And I'm in the industry. So I think it's important to get somebody that you trust, that is knowledgeable, and have them look documents over, regardless. Even if you've reached agreement, I think it's still okay whether you've worked with a real estate broker that you're comfortable with and you want to say, hey, will you take a look at this? Or you need to go out to legal counsel and have them review it, just in a very amicable fashion. Just get another set of eyes on it. But signing something just because somebody puts it in front of you is never a good idea.
And it doesn't help either party to sign a document that you can't fulfill.
Okay. Fair enough. Good. I give good advice for not being in that field. Listen, I want to thank you for both of your time and just being able to share with us your viewpoint on what happens in landlord and tenant situations that are coming up right now. It's scary times. It's unprecedented times. Nobody knows what to do. The calls that our chamber is getting right now, our best answers are, yes, maybe they don't know because they've never been in this situation and you've never been in this situation. So we're all trying to figure it out as we go along. So it's very beneficial to have people like Jerry and Karen, both of you here, to just kind of talk us through situations that are new to everybody and we're all treading in new water. So I thank you again, Jerry Schmidt from Pacifica Realty and Karen O'Neill from Kirk and Simas. Thanks so much for joining today, and look forward to seeing you in person eventually.